My parents laughed when I said I didn't need their money. You'll be back begging. They mocked. I smiled and left. A month later they were begging me after they found out. I still remember the way they laughed. My father leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with that smug grin, while my mother covered her mouth, trying, and failing, to stifle her amusement. You'll be back begging, my dad said, tapping the side of his whiskey glass. You think you can make it without us? Without our money? I just smiled, gripping the handle of my suitcase. Watch me. And then I walked out the door. Growing up in a family like mine, wealth was never the problem. Control was. My parents wielded their money like a leash, tightening it whenever I stepped out of line, loosening it just enough to keep me dependent. Every major decision I ever made, what college to attend, what career path to follow, who I associated with, had been dictated by them. If I protested, the response was always the same. Who pays for your car? Who covers your rent? Who puts food on your plate? The unspoken threat was clear. Obey, or watch it all disappear. I had endured it for years. Smiled through gritted teeth. Nodded when they dismissed my ambitions as cute ideas. But the night I finally told them I didn't need their money, the night I walked away from the life they built for me, I saw it in their eyes. They were convinced I'd fail. They thought I'd come crawling back, humiliated. But they underestimated me. And 1 month later, the roles had reversed in a way none of us could have imagined. At first, I had nothing but my savings, a half-packed apartment, and an idea, a risky, uncertain idea that I hadn't dared to share with my parents. They never believed in me anyway. For years, I had been working on a project in secret. Late nights, stolen hours between meetings at the corporate job my father arranged for me. While they thought I was just another cog in their well-oiled legacy, I was building something of my own. A tech startup, small, scrappy, but with potential. I knew the market. I knew the demand. And most importantly, I had something money couldn't buy: hunger. With the last of my funds, I pushed everything into launching the app one had spent the last year perfecting. It wasn't glamorous. My office was a rented co-working space where I lived on black coffee and vending machine snacks. My team? Just me and a couple of college friends who believed in the vision as much as I did. Meanwhile, my parents wasted no time making sure everyone knew how foolish I was. At dinner parties, they turned my decision into a joke. He left to chase a dream, my mother would say, rolling her eyes. Can you imagine? He could have taken over the family business, but no, he wanted to build an app. My father would shake his head in mock pity. Give it a few weeks. He'll be back once the reality of the real world hits. They were so sure I'd fail. So sure I'd regret leaving. But life has a funny way of turning the tables. Because just 3 weeks after I walked out, my app exploded. A viral post. A feature in a major tech blog. Suddenly, investors were calling me. Not because of my last name. Not because of my family's wealth. But because I had built something people actually wanted. And just as my company was taking off, my parents' world was quietly crumbling behind the scenes. They just didn't know it yet. I didn't know how bad things were for my parents until my uncle let it slip. Have you talked to your dad lately? He asked over the phone, his voice unusually hesitant. I hadn't. After I left, I made a point to cut off all contact. No calls. No messages. If they were waiting for me to come crawling back, they were going to be waiting forever. Not really. Why? I asked, feigning indifference. There was a pause. Then he sighed. Their latest investment. It tanked. Badly. That got my attention. My father had always fancied himself a financial genius. He prided himself on his business acumen, making high-risk investments and acting like he had the Midas touch. But I also knew his ego made him reckless. He never planned for failure, because in his mind failure was for people who weren't him. What happened? I asked. That real estate deal he kept bragging about. The luxury development overseas? Turns out, it was a scam. He poured millions into it, and now it's all gone. Investors are pulling out, and... My uncle hesitated again. Look, don't tell him I told you, but he's in trouble. I leaned back in my chair, letting his words settle. I should have felt something, pity, concern, even a flicker of sympathy. But all I felt was satisfaction. For years, my father had held money over my head, using it as a leash, a weapon, a way to remind me that he was the one in control. And now, for the first time in his life, he was powerless. And the irony? While his empire crumbled, I was on the rise. My app had gained over 500,000 users in less than a month. Investors were offering numbers I never thought I'd see. What my parents always assumed was a cute hobby had turned into something real, something bigger than them. And then, just as I was reveling in the sweet taste of poetic justice, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Mom. I stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. I already knew why she was calling. They weren't laughing anymore. I let the phone ring. Then I let it ring again. For years, they had conditioned me to believe that I needed them. That without their money, their influence, their name, I was nothing. Now, just a month after I left, they were the ones calling me. The irony was almost too perfect. After the fourth missed call, my mother finally left a voicemail. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the best of me. Her voice came through, tight with forced calm. Sweetheart, it's your mother. I know things were tense when you left, but we need to talk. It's important. She hesitated, then added, Your father and we're dealing with a situation. Call me back. A situation. That was one way to describe losing millions in a botched investment. I smirked and tossed my phone onto the desk. They could wait. I had work to do. 2 days later. My resolve cracked faster than I expected. Not because I felt guilty, far from it. But because I was curious. So when my mother called again, I picked up. The moment I answered, I could hear the difference. Gone was the usual arrogance, the thinly veiled condescension. Instead, her voice was soft, almost pleading. Oh, thank God you answered. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone casual. Busy. What do you need? She hesitated. We need a little help. There it was. I almost laughed out loud. A month ago, they mocked me for walking away. Now they needed me. Still, I played dumb. Help? With what? It's your father, she said quickly. He made some bad investments. People are panicking. There are legal threats, financial obligations. It's complicated. I bet it was. And? I prompted, making her say it. A pause. Then, finally, we need money. I grinned. Ah. There it is. You need money? I repeated, dragging out the words. I thought I was the one who wouldn't last a month without you. My mother inhaled sharply. Honey, please. This isn't the time to be petty. We're family. I had to bite back a laugh. Oh, now we were family? I thought about all the times they humiliated me, undermined me, made sure I knew I was nothing without them. And now? Now they were begging. I leaned forward, my voice calm and controlled. How much? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, finally, my mother cleared her throat. We need around $2 million. I almost choked on my own laughter. $2 million? I repeated, letting the number hang in the air. You think I just have that lying around? You're successful now, she said quickly. Your business is doing well. We saw the articles, the interviews. We know you have investors. Ah. So they'd been watching. A month ago, my career was nothing but a joke to them. Now that it was thriving, they suddenly cared. I rubbed my temple, shaking my head. And what do I get out of this? What do you mean? She asked, genuinely confused. I smiled. They still didn't get it. You always told me that nothing in life is free, I said smoothly. So tell me, what's in it for me? My mother hesitated. We're your parents. You're supposed to help us. I scoffed. Like how you helped me when I left? More silence. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying this far too much. I could help, I mused. But if I do, I have conditions. Conditions? She echoed, her voice tight. That's right. I let the words sink in. For years, they had used money as a leash to keep me obedient. Now, the power had shifted. It was my turn to hold the leash. What do you want? She asked carefully. I smiled. For starters, I want full ownership of Dad's company. What? She gasped. That's ridiculous. Your father built that business from the ground up. Yeah? And now it's failing. I'd be doing you a favor. She spluttered. There has to be something else. That's my offer, I said simply. Take it or leave it. I could almost hear her internal battle. Pride versus desperation. Finally, her voice wavered. I need to talk to your father. Of course you do. I checked the time. You have 24 hours. Then I hung up. Let them sweat. I didn't hear from them that night. I pictured my father pacing his office, jaw clenched, veins bulging in his forehead as he tried to find a way out of this. My mother would be the calmer one, whispering reassurances, convincing him that they had to take my offer. Because the truth was, they didn't have a choice. By morning, my phone buzzed. My father's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Yes? I said, keeping my voice deliberately casual. You think you're clever, don't you? His voice was cold, controlled, like he was still trying to hold on to whatever power he thought he had left. I don't think, I said smoothly. I know. We're not giving you the company. He snapped. That's out of the question. I shrugged. Then I guess this conversation is over. I was about to hang up when he growled. Wait. I smirked. There it is. We can negotiate. He said stiffly, as if the very word disgusted him. We'll give you a percentage of the company, enough to make you a shareholder, to have influence, but not ownership. I pretended to think. No. Be reasonable. He said through gritted teeth. We built this empire. You can't expect to take it from us. I laughed. That's funny, Dad. You didn't seem too worried about taking everything from me when I walked away. Silence. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying every second of this. You need money. I have money. This isn't about being fair, it's about survival. You want my help? Then I want the company. End of discussion. My father inhaled sharply, and for the first time in my life, I heard something in his voice I never expected. Defeat. Fine. I blinked. What? Fine. He barked, his pride cracking under the pressure. You want the company? It's yours. Just get us the damn money. I grinned. Pleasure doing business with you. 2 days later, I met them at their estate, or what was left of it. Gone was the arrogance, the condescension. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, her usual polished demeanor frayed at the edges. My father looked 10 years older, the weight of his failure sitting heavy on his shoulders. They didn't even invite me inside. Instead, we sat in their grand dining room, the same one where they had laughed in my face just weeks ago. Only now, no one was laughing. The contracts were placed in front of my father. A formal transfer of ownership, drafted by my lawyers. He didn't even look at me as he signed. My mother was the first to break the silence. This is hard for us, you know. I met her gaze, completely unbothered. Is it? We did everything for you. She continued weakly. You wouldn't have had these opportunities without us. I smiled. And yet here we are. My father's pen scratched against the paper, the final signature sealing the deal. When he was done, he set the pen down with a shaking hand. He looked up at me for the first time that day. Are you happy now? I picked up the contract, skimming the pages before folding it neatly into my briefcase. I'm satisfied. Then I stood up. Pleasure doing business with you. And just like that I walked out. For good. Walking out of that house, their house, felt different this time. The first time I left, they had mocked me, certain I'd fail. This time, they sat in silence, watching me go, knowing they had lost. I didn't look back. The moment I got in my car, I called my lawyer. It's done, I said, gripping the steering wheel. I'll have the official filings processed by the end of the week. He replied. Congratulations, you own your father's empire now. It should have felt surreal, but it didn't. Because I earned this. I drove straight to my new office, the same one my father had ruled from for years. Only now it was mine. The transition wasn't quiet. The news spread fast. His employees, his partners, even his rivals all found out within days that the mighty Richard Callahan had lost control of his own company. And the best part? He couldn't even spin it in his favor. The truth was out. He was desperate, broke, and forced to sell to the son he had publicly belittled. I made my first move the very next morning. I called an emergency meeting with the executive team. The same people who had spent years bowing to my father, treating me like an afterthought when I worked under him. They filed into the boardroom, quiet, uncertain, some avoiding eye contact altogether. I took my time settling into the chair at the head of the table, his chair. Then I clasped my hands together and spoke. My father ran this company on arrogance and fear. I began. That ends today. Some exchanged glances, unsure of where this was going. I know how he operated. I continued. I know how many of you did things his way because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't. But I don't rule by fear. I win by being smarter. I leaned forward. So here's how this works. You either get on board with the new direction, or you get out. No second chances. Silence. Then, slowly, the tension eased. Some nodded. A few even looked relieved. That's when I knew I had already won. Of course, my parents didn't take their downfall quietly. 2 days after the deal was finalized, I got a call from my mother. We need more time, she said, voice tight, to move out of the estate. I glanced at my watch. You have until the end of the week. That's not enough, she snapped, her usual sharpness returning. We built our lives here. I smirked. Funny. I seem to remember you telling me I needed to be able to make it on my own. I guess now it's your turn. She exhaled sharply. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I don't know, I said, pretending to think. Maybe a little. Silence. Then, her voice dropped to a whisper. Your father isn't handling this well. I almost laughed. He wasn't handling this well? I thought about all the times he had humiliated me. The times he had smirked, belittled me, made sure I knew I was beneath him. And now, he was the one spiraling. I shook my head. That's not my problem. Then I hung up. I gave them until Friday to vacate the estate. By Saturday morning, security confirmed they were gone. And just like that, the mighty Callahans were no longer kings. And me? I wasn't just their son anymore. I was their replacement. For the first time in my life, my parents were nobodies. No grand estate. No luxurious parties. No business empire to lord over. They had spent decades wielding power like a weapon, crushing anyone who stood in their way, including me. Now, they were just another cautionary tale of arrogance gone wrong. And I wasn't done yet. A week after they moved out of the estate, I made one last move, the kind that would ensure they never got back on their feet. I bought out their debts. Every bad investment, every outstanding loan, every desperate deal they had made in an attempt to stay afloat, I acquired it all through a network of shell companies. Then I called my father. He didn't answer the first 3 times. But on the 4th, he picked up. His voice was low, raw. What do you want? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city skyline from my office, his old office. You owe money, I said. A lot of it. Silence. I just bought your debts, I continued, letting the words settle. Which means you don't owe faceless creditors anymore. You owe me. A sharp inhale on the other end. You wouldn't. I smirked. You always told me to think like a businessman. So here's the deal, you pay me back on my terms, or I take whatever little you have left. You're destroying us, he growled. Your own parents. I laughed. No, Dad. You destroyed yourselves. I just made sure you couldn't recover. For the first time, my father had nothing left to say. I let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. Oh, and by the way, I said, my voice calm, amused. The estate? I'm selling it. Thought you should know. Then, before he could sputter out another pathetic excuse, I ended the call. I didn't hear from them after that. No calls. No messages. Nothing. But I kept tabs on them, of course I did. They ended up renting a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, a far cry from the mansion they once ruled over. My father's reputation was in shambles. My mother no longer had high society to parade through. They were, for the first time in their lives, ordinary. And me? I thrived. My company continued to explode. I expanded the business I took from my father, modernized it, and turned it into something he never could. And one night, as I sat in my penthouse apartment, overlooking the city, I thought back to that moment, the night I left their house, with nothing but my suitcase and my pride. They had laughed at me. They had mocked me. But in the end, they were wrong. I was never the one who needed them. They were the ones who had needed me. And now, they had nothing. For months, life was quiet. My parents had faded into the background, reduced to a shadow of what they once were. No more lavish parties, no more smug lectures about success. The world they built had crumbled, and I had made sure there was no rebuilding it. I should have felt satisfied. I should have felt victorious. But there was one loose end. My mother. Unlike my father, who had buried himself in shame, my mother had always been the more strategic one. The one who knew how to manipulate, how to twist words and emotions to get what she wanted. So it wasn't surprising when, after months of silence, she finally reached out. A text. Can we meet? Just once. No tricks, I promise. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't owe her anything. I knew that. But part of me was curious. What could she possibly want? I agreed to meet her at a small cafe downtown. A neutral place. Public. No home court advantage for either of us. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a table by the window, dressed far more simply than I ever remembered. Gone were the designer bags, the expensive jewelry. For the first time in my life, she looked normal. She smiled when she saw me. You actually came. I sat down across from her, folding my arms. I have 10 minutes. Make it count. She sighed. You always were so cold. I raised an eyebrow. I wonder where I learned that from. She flinched but quickly recovered. I'm not here to argue, she said. I just wanted to talk. I waited. She stirred her coffee, staring at it like it held all the answers. Your father, he's not doing well. I stayed silent. The stress, the humiliation, he's not the man he used to be, she continued. He barely speaks. He just sits at home all day, staring at the walls. He's lost everything, and he knows it. I shrugged. Sounds like karma to me. She let out a bitter laugh. I knew you'd say that. I leaned forward. What do you want, Mother? She hesitated. I want to fix this. I almost laughed in her face. Fix what? The years of manipulation? The control? The fact that you and Dad only ever saw me as an extension of your own power? She reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. I know we made mistakes. I pulled my hand away. Mistakes? I repeated. A mistake is forgetting to pick your kid up from school. A mistake is burning dinner. You and Dad didn't make mistakes. You made choices. She exhaled sharply. Fine. We made choices. And some of them were wrong. But that doesn't mean we don't love you. I stared at her, searching for something, regret, sincerity, anything. But all I saw was desperation. Love? I repeated. You love me now that you have nothing. Where was that love when you were laughing at me? When you were waiting for me to fail? When you cancelled my plane ticket just to prove a point? She looked down. We were wrong. Yeah, I said coldly. You were. Silence stretched between us. So what happens now? She asked quietly. Are we just done? I took a deep breath. That depends. She looked up, hopeful. On what? I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. On whether you finally understand that I don't need you anymore. I left her sitting there, watching me walk away just like I had walked away from them months ago. This time, she didn't laugh. She didn't mock me. She didn't call me back. She just sat there, finally realizing the truth. They were nothing without me. And I was better without them. Months passed. I never saw my parents again. Their names faded from the business world, their influence gone. The once powerful Callahan family was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a story of arrogance, greed, and a son who refused to be controlled. As for me, I thrived. My company grew beyond what I had ever imagined, and for the first time, I lived my life on my terms. No more waiting for approval. No more begging for respect. I had won. And the best part? I never had to look back.